News and Analysis program brought to you by CODEPINK's Latin America team. Tonight, I'm joined by CODEPINK co-founder Medea Benjamin, and we'll be speaking with Tracey Eaton of the Cuba Money Project. Take it away.
Yes, well, we're very excited about the program tonight. Tracey is an award-winning writer, a producer, multimedia journalist. He's worked throughout Latin America, and his stories have appeared in hundreds of outlets, including NBC, USA Today, Business Insider, Newsweek. He travels often to Cuba, and he is the founder of a very unique project, which is called the Cuba Money Project. And it's something, I think, Tracey, that you started in 2010, then stopped for a while, then started back up again. It tracks US tax dollars spent in Cuba, an important thing for us to know and something that is rarely talked about in the US media. So we're excited to have some time with you, Tracey. And can you tell us about the Cuba Money Project?
Well, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, as you say, I started it about 10 years ago. 10, 11 years ago. And I was curious to see, how the US government was spending its money, our money, tax dollars in Cuba. And I wondered, it's been now more than 60 years that the US government has been trying to influence internal events there in Cuba, and millions of dollars have been spent. And rather than wait until some documents are declassified, I wanted to try to get a more of a real-time view of what the programs were doing and whether they're effective. And so I started trying to follow the money, use that old journalist slogan. And so that's how I got it started.
Wonderful. Well, can you tell us, give us a sense of how you do this, what you found, if you can help us understand how much money is going to Cuba and who is it going to?
Sure. Can I share my screen for a moment?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so. Okay, so I used to work in Cuba. I was the Dallas Morning News correspondent in Havana for about 4 years. And so I've been traveling to Cuba since 1994, been very interested in what goes on there. And after I started the Cuba Money Project, well, the reason I started the Cuba Money Project, one reason was I saw that nobody was doing it. And I thought that, it's such a fundamental, important thing to know, not just what the US government policy is, but where the money goes. I decided to just start looking into it. And what I've discovered is that there are, at any one moment, dozens of NGOs and also for-profit groups that support Cuban democracy activists and journalists and dissidents. And by my estimates, about a fifth of all the projects are secret, and the recipients of the money are never disclosed. And very conservatively, I can say that USAID and the State Department have spent more than $300 million on the program since 1990. And there's also been a lot of money that's gone toward Radio and TV Marti, around $1 billion. Under President Trump, at least 54 groups operated USAID, or National Endowment for Democracy programs. I want to play about a 1-minute clip of a prominent Cuban dissident talking about his view of the support that they receive.
La solidaridad, el apoyo es indispensable. ¿Qué sería de los Castros sin el apoyo primero de la Unión Soviética? ¿Qué hubiese sido de los Castros sin el apoyo actual de Venezuela? Imposible de sostener el régimen. ¿Qué puede hacer la oposición contra un aparato represivo que, como le dije anteriormente, cuenta con tantos medios? ¿Qué puede hacer? Por mucho que sea su valor, por mucha que sea su firmeza, no podría hacer nada. Yo le acostumbro a decir a los agentes de la policía política cuando tocan este tema, no, porque ustedes reciben recursos de Norteamérica, le digo, ¿y ustedes cuándo han vivido sin recursos del exterior? ¿Cuándo han vivido sin la ayuda soviética o sin la ayuda venezolana? pero no solamente eso digo nosotros, yo le digo, se lo digo incluso de una manera jocosa que a ellos lo molesta mucho, le digo, con el 5% del presupuesto que tienen ustedes en la policía política, democratizamos a Cuba en 6 meses.
So I've tried to get details on specifically what the projects are, like you know, how they work and what the goals are. And so I've tried to use the Freedom of Information Act. And in 2011, I just started filing a flurry of FOIA requests. And
maybe you could explain FOIA in case anybody doesn't know what that is.
Sure. So the Freedom of Information Act allows anyone, not just U.S. citizens, but foreigners to send in a request for documents about programs and policies that you're interested in. And it's a kind of a laborious process. It takes a long time to get an answer from the US government sometimes. And just a couple weeks ago, I got, the State Department got in touch with me and said, are you still, or no, it was USAID. They said, are you still interested in this FOIA that you filed? And it was one that I filed 10 years ago. And I said, yes, of course I'm still interested. You know, I would hate to have them just throw it in the trash after I've been waiting for 10 years for a document. So it can take a long time. And I think the FOIA, the system it's broken in a way because it takes so long. And also they give you heavily redacted documents like this. Here's a sheet that I received for one Cuba program. Everything's redacted. So this is the kind of stuff that you get back after waiting for sometimes years and even appealing to get information. And this is what you get back. So there are two main reasons why they deny access to the information. One is that they say democracy building is a trade secret, which seems pretty strange to me that it would be a trade secret, but it is. They can't, you know, the for-profit and nonprofit companies that do democracy building don't want to share their techniques with other groups. And then they also want to protect the security of the participants. And then I can understand a little bit more because they might face reprisals. This photo there is of a boogie board that's really a satellite dish that was part of a US finance program where they were smuggling boogie boards into Cuba disguised as satellite dishes in one of the programs. And so I would
mean the other way around. They were satellite dishes disguised as boogie boards.
Yeah, sorry, I said it wrong. and so there, I would say there's not just two reasons why they don't reveal information. The third reason is to save themselves from embarrassment, because sometimes the schemes that they have to try to bring democracy to Cuba are pretty wacky. And the money can be difficult to trace because it's sometimes channeled through third countries. And if an NGO, for instance, is operating in the United States, they have to file a Form 990, a tax form, and then they reveal what they did with the money. You know, they give some details. But if they're operating in a third country, oftentimes they don't have to file the same kinds of forms, and it's easier to hide what they're doing. This gives you a sense for some of the USAID payments for Cuba programs. The big dip there from 2015 to 2017, that's during a period of improved US-Cuba relations during the Obama administration. And then you can see when Trump took office, they kicked the programs back into gear.
So we see a dip from a high of about 10 million going down to less than, well, just a little bit over 1 million.
Yeah, and this doesn't represent the entirety of all the US programs. This is just one specific USAID. State Department also has programs, and but I wanted to try to
TV Marti is separate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is USAID grant payments from 2012 to 2020. And I wanted to try to show kind of a timeline, you know, when diplomatic relations were renewed and kind of what the funding picture looked like. And this is by quarter. And so you can see more clearly by quarter the big rise after Donald Trump took office.
So basically, it's clear when you look at this that when there's an opening of relations and more of a respect of Cuba's sovereignty, then the funding for these projects goes way down. When it's a more hostile relationship and more overt kind of trying to threaten, and of course, the ultimate goal is to overthrow the Cuban government, then the funding goes way up. Is that how you would read that?
That's kind of what it looked like to me. Again, this didn't take into account State Department money, and so I don't have the full picture, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the funding dropped during that period of improved relations.
Well, and obviously, if you're trying to have good talks with the Cubans, they hate the Cuban government. They hate these programs, right?
Yeah, they object to them, and they're not legal under Cuban law.
And they
It's
certainly,
curious.
what?
Sorry, it's curious to me that it seemed like the funding before the rapprochement was actually a little bit higher during the Obama era compared to the Trump era. What do you attribute that to?
Well, Donald Trump took a very dim view of foreign aid, and these assistance programs fall under foreign aid. And so the White House, the budget office, the White House budget office would propose drastic cuts, and then the political interests would kick in, and they would ask for more money from what was proposed by the White House. And so it was a very contradictory kind of approach. Trump seemed to attack Cuba more with sanctions than with these programs. These programs are largely symbolic because it's such a small amount of money compared to the entire US budget. But you can do a lot of mischief in Cuba with a small amount of money. And they're also significant just because of the historical, you look at history and the US government's role in Cuba in trying to intervene over so many decades, they become very important in that way. But Trump did not. I mean, George W. Bush, during his administration, these programs peaked at something like, I can't remember, 40 million or 42 million, something like that. So it was nothing compared to what Trump and Obama did. I mean, the money has gone way down. But again, you can do a lot with not a lot of money. You can cause quite a bit of discord with a smaller amount of money.
Well, especially since salaries are so low in Cuba, paying somebody a good salary in Cuba would be like $100 a month, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Imagine what you could do with a budget of $100,000.
So this is just a general idea for, where that USAID money went. So these are some of the big categories here.
So the biggest ones are humanitarian assistance to Cuba. So what does that mean?
That a lot of that goes to dissidents, but as I'll show you, the amount of money that reaches the people on the ground, who are really the ones who are risking their necks, is a tiny amount of money compared to the salaries and overhead and all the money that goes toward the people who run the programs in Miami and in Washington and other cities. So a lot of the money, one time I asked a USAID official how much money really reaches Cuba. And he said, well, the intention is that the vast majority reaches Cuba. But it doesn't happen. The vast majority does not reach Cuba. The dissident leader that I showed you before in that little video clip, Jose Daniel Ferrer, he's not joking when he said that if we had all that money, we could do a lot more, because all that money does not reach the dissidents. And that's why I think in some ways this is more political than it is. If the US government wanted to really do something, they could dump a whole lot more money onto Cuba than what they do. And
are you going to give us an estimate of how much money actually reaches Cuba?
Yeah, I'll show some examples of what Cuban dissidents get.
Uh-huh.
So the purpose of this little snapshot here is to show that a lot of these programs last from 1 to 3 years. And so even though, there's a certain amount of grants, say 15 million given out in 1 year, those then last for 3 years. And so at any one moment, you have really dozens of projects going at once, overlapping by time, overlapping by theme. And sometimes organizations run a number of different Cuba programs. And so it becomes very difficult to try to follow all these, because each one, you could spend quite a bit of time just trying to figure out what one organization is doing. But, it's tough to figure it all out. So these organizations are some of the ones that were prominent during the Trump years.
So can you just give us a sense of, where is most of the money, what kind of programs are receiving most of the money?
The vast majority of the money goes toward shaping the narrative about Cuba. It's a low intensity war, but it's an information war in a lot of ways. The whole idea is to shape the narrative. And so the money goes to groups that highlight human rights abuses, and it becomes kind of a echo chamber where a group will highlight certain human rights abuses, and then that'll go into a report, which will then be used to push for more money for more programs and other groups. And so it kind of feeds on itself. I mean, I don't think it would be inaccurate to say that these programs give a distorted view of Cuba. I'm not saying that they don't reveal some truths and do some important work. And I'm not saying that there aren't courageous people involved in these programs. But I think that it's certainly true that the overall picture that they would give would be a one-sided kind of distorted view of Cuba, which is used to try to secure more funds for more programs.
And wouldn't you also say, Tracey, that when a group it becomes known for getting money from the United States, that destroys the legitimacy of that group in the eyes of many Cuban people?
Well, I mean, the Cuban government has its position on that. I don't want to broad brush all the groups and say that their work would be destroyed their image would be destroyed just because they receive U.S. funds. I'll let other people weigh in on the politics of it. So we were talking about how much money reaches Cuba, and it's impossible to know exactly how much reaches Cuba, but there are clues that are scattered out in public documents. This is from a Form 990 public document showing that the Directorio Democrático Cubano paid 746 people a little over $100,000, or about $138 per person, but that would be over a 1-year period. So it's not a lot of money.
But it's, as you said, illegal. So those 700 plus people would be taking money illegally. Yeah,
illegally by Cuban law.
Right.
And then here's another tax form. This is other money that went to 1,930 activists, and this would be $25 each. So there's no, I don't know how that money was distributed. Maybe certain people who were the leaders got way more. I really don't have a picture for how that works.
And who knows if it's true?
Yeah, it's what they report. And these millions of dollars, the US government spends millions of dollars just to audit all these groups. And I filed FOIAs to try to get the audits and have not been successful. So sometimes when I'm going through the records to look for, what happens with the money, I find really strange payments. So this is an example of a payment that to me looked very strange. $3.2 million to a law firm. This is Scott Gilbert in the photo. And look at the description: strengthen the legal, regulatory, institutional, and information environment which protects and enables the growth in associational life and the development of independent and sustainable civil society organizations. So what the heck does that mean?
And this group is in Miami?
No, the law firm, I believe the law firm's based in DC. But as it turns out, Scott Gilbert is Alan Gross's lawyer.
And
so
who is Alan Gross?
Alan Gross is an international development worker who was working for a USAID subcontractor, and he went to Cuba to install Wi-Fi hotspots that were independent and would get around Cuba's internet and communication system. And so they would be independent Wi-Fi hotspots where people could go to use the internet. And on his fifth trip to Cuba, it wasn't legal. On his fifth trip to Cuba, he was arrested and he wound up spending, I think, 5 years in prison. And he was eventually released as part of the negotiations between the US and Cuba as they resumed diplomatic relations. And so that's Alan right down there on the right. And, I think that Alan Gross he's a highly qualified international development worker, was doing had a very successful business, successful career, but he probably wasn't the right person for this job because he didn't speak Spanish. And so he went to Cuba, and he later sued his employer, saying that they didn't adequately prepare him for Cuba, and that he, suggesting that he didn't know what he was getting himself into, because, the Cuba has a very sophisticated security service that will detect these kinds of programs and then surveil them. And down here, the photo that's right to the left of Alan Gross is a screenshot of a Cuban agent there on the right. And then on the left is an American who worked with one of the USAID or State Department contractors working in Cuba. And that's surveillance that they had on them. So the programs operating in Cuba, sometimes the operators of those programs may not know that they're being recorded and they're under surveillance and all. And so Alan Gross, the Cuban government was up on what he was doing the whole time.
Do you know if he won his lawsuit?
He received a settlement, and he now lives in Tel Aviv. And we're Facebook friends, and I've written extensively about him and his case, which I found really interesting because as part of his case, there were way more documents revealed about how these programs work than FOIA would ever deliver. And so one thing I discovered because of his lawsuit and his efforts to get accountability was that there are just hundreds of pages of documents that are never even offered to you when you file a FOIA. The things that were revealed in his case, I'd filed FOIAs for the same kind of information and I would get almost nothing in return. So the documents exist. It's just that the government doesn't want to give you the documents. And it's pretty ridiculous because the State Department and USAID, before they answer a FOIA, they give the contractor the opportunity to say what documents should be released. So they leave it up to the contractor to decide what gets released. And they say that's part of the reason for the delay. Oh, we're contacting the contractor to see what's okay to release. Of course, they're not going to release anything, and they don't. And so it is not a transparent system at all. And
what you showed us before of the firm Gilbert that represented Alan Gross, so the U.S. taxpayers paid for his legal support.
Yeah, well, as you can see from this description, we don't know exactly what it paid for, but it paid for something. This 3.2 million was probably, taxpayers got their money's worth because at least this helped the two countries come together. At least that's the way I look at it. So this was probably a good thing. But my point about showing this description of the spending is also just to say that they can say anything they want. They can put down any purpose and any description, and most people don't even look, don't even care, and millions of dollars are spent. Other times the description on what they spend is so vague that it might as well be redacted, because it's just not a, it doesn't mean anything. So I've interviewed a wide range of people who are connected with the programs. I've interviewed a lot of dissidents, many of whom I admire for their courage and for what they do. I've interviewed Cuban officials. I've talked to Cuban state security agents who have infiltrated programs, like this woman here, Agent Vilma, who infiltrated one of the democracy groups and was in there for quite a few years before the Cuban government decided to reveal her identity. And at any one moment, the Cuban government is going to have people placed in all these programs, I would imagine, based on history and based on, from time to time, the Cuban government will reveal, okay, we had these 10 people placed in all these different organizations, and then they'll produce concrete evidence of how things work, and they'll produce documents and photos and other things. And so this is also part of, the Cuban government. They're trying to protect themselves. And what I was alluding to before about the fact that I think this is an information war and the one-sided nature of it is that there's a lot of things that you can investigate or write about Cuba, and you don't have to always just look for the very worst thing. I mean, if we could do that for the United States, and you could uncover quite a few negative things about the United States if we put millions of dollars into investigating what goes on in our country. As part of this effort to try to bring out the kind of the worst things that it can find, here's about $5 million for 2 programs, one to raise awareness about the failures of the Cuban Revolution, another to investigate Cuban doctors working abroad. So Cuban doctors, that picture on the left, I took that of 2 Cuban doctors who I met in Haiti when Aristide was forced out of the country and all the hospitals closed, and there was nowhere to get where people could get treated for gunshot wounds except one little clinic operated by Cuban doctors, and they never closed. And that was a place where if you get shot, and there were people dragging themselves in and going to this little clinic and getting treated by these Cuban doctors. And so I saw with my own eyes some of the good work that Cuban doctors do. And yet there's millions of dollars being spent to really demonize what Cuban doctors do. And sure, they do get a smaller, they get only a portion of the total amount of money that a foreign government might pay the Cuban government for their services. But I never saw any Cuban doctors who were forced to go abroad. They wanted to go abroad because they would get more money than they would get in Cuba. And they would also have other benefits of being able to import, I think maybe either a container load of things, or, they could bring in things from other countries to help their families. So that's one of the things that our tax dollars are going to.
Well, we can also add there that our government officials, particularly under Trump, were strong-arming other countries to either send back the Cuban doctors that were there or to not request for help. And that was very clear during this pandemic, when the US government has told other countries, don't accept the help that Cuban doctors were offering to several dozen countries. And it has really affected the income of the Cuban government, because they were making at one point quite a lot of money from the monies being paid by other governments or UN agencies for the doctors abroad. So this is a little bit of money that was spent to make the program look bad, and then that and then and getting doctors to defect, and then that was used as a way to go to the governments of these other countries to say, look how bad this program is.
And there's thousands of doctors that have served, so I'm sure you can find 10 who are going to say awful things. So I think there's a lack of balance. So the United Nations, it's not just Cuban law that prohibits the United States from intervening in Cuba, but also the United Nations has resolutions that speak out against this. And there's also, of course, the United Nations says that governments should promote and defend all human rights. So this is from a recent report by the Center for Democracy in the Americas and the Washington Office on Latin America. And it suggests that human rights would be better served in Cuba by trying to engage the country rather than running these provocative democracy programs. So there are alternatives that some people support, and there have been tens of thousands of people that have joined in petitions and other groups to try to eliminate the economic sanctions against Cuba, which represent the longest, harshest sanctions against any country in history, as far as I know. So those are the slides I was going to show. So I'll stop sharing my screen here and would be happy to try to maybe answer any questions you have or whatever I can do to help.
Well, thank you, Tracey. That's fascinating. I wanted to ask you what you thought maybe were an example of the biggest waste of US money or the most negative consequences, and maybe a program you thought was actually good.
Let's see. I think the biggest wastes have probably been some money spent just to do studies. And, the US government will ask a university or a think tank to study a problem, and then they'll employ people to do it and then put it out there. And I'd say that's probably the biggest waste.
Wouldn't it be more of a waste, all the money we put into radio and TV Marti over these years that barely gets seen in Cuba?
Well, I try to avoid giving an opinion on the value of the different programs. I'd rather put out information about them and let other people decide whether they think that they're a waste of money or not.
Well, the Cuban government blocked those for so many years. You couldn't even see radio, TV Marti in Cuba, and we were still paying for it.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. Here's what the part of that I would agree with that I can say for certain is, there were planes that were in hangars that were paying rent on related to radio and TV Marti. And, spending all that money to reach only 10 people or whatever. I mean, I think that can be considered a waste too, but I'm not gonna weigh in on whether, I think that a free flow of information is a good thing. And I think that it's good that there's a flow of information. So, but as far as saying this program's good, this one's bad or whatever, I'm not going to get into that.
To me, I kind of find it fascinating that so much of this money is spent here in the United States. And it really seems like there's an industry now that's benefiting from these attempts at regime change in Cuba. Would you agree with that? Yeah,
for sure. And Phil Peters, who's a Cuba expert, and he's often quoted about Cuba, he called it the democracy promotion industrial complex or something like that. And I thought that was a good term for it, because it is a little cottage industry of NGOs and other companies that are just involved in this work. And the category of funds that is spent in Cuba, it's in the same category of economic support, which in another country it might go to helping reduce hunger or something like that. And so it's in a category of aid that other countries would welcome, but we're giving it to Cuba against their will. And so it's a very overtly political type of assistance.
Now, I know, you, unlike us, we get into the politics of it all, which you don't, and I appreciate that. But I do want to say that I have seen how this money divides groups inside Cuba, delegitimizes groups inside Cuba. You take, for example, hip hop artists. I remember when hip hop was all the rage in Cuba, and it was a really cool movement. And then US started putting money into it to influence it. And then the whole movement got divided. And we see now with the San Isidro movement that what might be a legitimate call for more freedom of cultural expression gets immediately co-opted because it's fulfilling a goal of the U.S. government to create more opposition in Cuba. And again, I don't want to put you on the spot to comment on it, but I've seen how it backfires inside Cuba. And I would say that it doesn't create more openings and more reforms and more democracy, quite the opposite. It causes the Cuban government to crack down and put a lot of people in the same boat and accusing them of taking government money, even if they're not, because there have been so many examples of these efforts being financed by the US.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I can see the harm that can be done in that way. The reason that I guess I was being so kind of vague or maybe even evasive about trying to say something about the value or lack of value of some of the projects is that I've known people who were closely involved with them, and I've seen some good work that they're doing, and I'll give an example. Some years ago, I was going through these spreadsheets and I found something that I thought was astounding. And it was that there was a former covert action officer for the CIA who was managing a team of journalists in Cuba. I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And so I immediately blogged about it. I wrote a big long piece about it. And then as I would go to Cuba and I would talk to people, I met one of the journalists who was being paid by the program that hired the former CIA officer. And this journalist was not a human rights activist, but just a straight journalist who would go out and do some of the best reporting I saw in neighborhoods in Havana. When there were floods in Havana, he went into the water up to his neck to go report with a microphone and a video camera, and he went into people's flooded homes up to his chest in water and interviewed people to give a apolitical view of what was going on in their neighborhoods. He wasn't condemning the Cuban government. He was just telling a story about, a journalism story, just like CNN would have done or some other news outlet would have done. And
just like Cubans do all the time without being paid by the US.
Yeah, but my point is, I don't want to broad brush, I don't think all these people should be broad brushed and say, okay, just because you get funds, I don't think their work should be necessarily delegitimatized. But by the same token, let's take another case, not the case of, okay, this, what I consider a very good journalist going in and reporting on the flood, but there are other instances of episodes and things that have happened. Like, I'll mention two things: the death of Osvaldo Payá and the death of Laura Poyan. Both those, if you start Googling Laura Poyan or Osvaldo Payá, you're gonna find a lot of people who will say that they were murdered. And my view is, I don't think there was ever enough evidence to show that Osvaldo Payá was murdered. He was killed in a car accident. His supporters and his family say that state security agents rammed his car from behind and forced him into a tree but there were other people in the car with him. And I just think it's crazy to think that state security would decide, okay, let's go kill Osvaldo Payá. And it's okay that we have these couple foreigners in the car. We'll kill them too. Who cares? It would be a boneheaded move. I just don't think it happened. And yet, if you talk to, there are programs now that rely on the legacy of Osvaldo Payá, funded by the US government, to promote the idea that it was a murder and he's a martyr. And similarly, Laura Poyan, who died of an illness in a hospital, and I don't think she was secretly injected by some concoction by a government agent. I think she probably just died. And so US funds now go toward promoting this narrative that I think is probably false. I mean, I don't have all the facts. I can't say with absolute certainty, but let's say I'm just not convinced that those narratives are true. That I think is harmful. So if you want harmful, but having a Cuban reporter getting paid to go out and cover environmental problems or things going on in neighborhoods and things like that, I think that's good. So that's about where I would go is to try to make a judgment on some of the programs.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the distinction that you're making, but I think the counter argument is that if you, as a journalist, even someone who might not necessarily take a position that's oppositional to the government, but if you take funds from a country that's been sanctioning and threatening your country with regime change and war for 60 years, sanctions that have caused devastation to the economy and the families and the health and everything, you can imagine, then that almost kind of has to delegitimize you in the face of your peers, of your fellow citizens in some way. But I mean, respecting your point of view, of course.
Yes, and I think we also really respect your work and profit from it because, as you said in the beginning, there's so few people who are looking into this, and this is our money. And now that we have a new administration and we're trying to get them to turn the wheels around and go back to the Obama years and establish normal relations with Cuba, if we had normal relations, these programs wouldn't be a problem. Because we have these kind of programs in places around the world. And so I think the issue is, how do we stop the US government from trying to overthrow the Cuban government and instead have programs and use of our tax dollars that are actually helping Cubans and trying to build a more robust economy, a more robust democracy. I mean, all of that could be positive in a different situation. So I want to thank you, Tracey, for spending your time with us and for showing people how we can get this information. And let's just once again give out the website so they can go and learn more.
CubaMoneyProject.com.
And is there anything final? Yes, anything final you want to say before we close?
Just that I'm very grateful that you would invite me to talk about this, and it's been great fun, and I appreciate it.
And I hope people follow your example and start doing something similar for Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran, all these other countries where we have so much money being spent in a very non-transparent manner. Thanks so much for your time, Tracey.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tracey. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.